good morning, good afternoon, or perhaps good evening. I am Shihan Ron Layton, and I'd like to introduce you to a brand new podcast. The podcast is called the Quanmu Monologue. So what's the idea? Why are we doing this? Well, the central idea and the central focus is to have a conversation with noted practitioners from all across the Quanmu family. Why would we do this? Well, quite simply, we're interested in learning more about our own people, what makes us special, what makes us tick. And hopefully we can get into some conversations, and we, as Quanmu practitioners, we can learn more about our own people, the lived experiences of some of our most noted Quanmu practitioners. So that's it. Short and sweet. Stay tuned for the Quanmu Monologue. Take care. I'll be your host, Shihan Ron Layton.
I'm Shihan Ron Layton, your host for this edition of the Quanmu Monologue. I'm pleased to have with us this evening Shihan David Ames. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's wonderful to be here.
And I got to tell you, it's wonderful for the listeners to be able to access what we're going to talk about at their leisure, and I'm looking forward to talking about your career, the things that you think about Quanmu martial arts, and I'm thanking you in advance for your time. So let's just jump right into this and give us an idea about you. Who are you and what do you do for a living?
You know, I put a lot of time into thinking about that kind of approach. Who am I? Wow. I'm still looking for that after 65 years. I'm still trying to find out what is my true nature. But beyond that, what I view myself as is I'm a father, a brother, a friend, I'm a teacher. And I teach not only for a living, but I teach because it's a way of life. I was born to be a teacher. My father was a part-time professor at the University of Akron in addition to running his own business. My mother was a trained English teacher, which helped as far as speech because, doggone it, she corrected my grammar up until the day she died.
So, you know, for the listeners, I think the idea of the podcast, the idea of the Quanmu Monologue is for listeners to get additional insight into, you know, folks who are within our Quanmu family, particularly the Shihan. So would you say in your DNA, academics, intellect, all of those things are things that you bring to your study of the martial arts as well as to the manner in which you instruct? Is that fair?
Well, we'll say intellect for as much as I have. Yes, I would say yes.
Well, having been around you for a long time, I would say that I agree with you wholeheartedly. So, so in terms of who you are, let's be a little bit more probative. So what do you want people to know about you?
That's a difficult question because, quite frankly, when I was younger, if you met me within 5 minutes, you knew my entire life story. I was an open book. And as I've gotten older, I've become perhaps more curmudgeonly and by far more reclusive. I'm less concerned with what people know about me than just meeting me and finding what they find. Because the things that I do, the things that appear to be what I'm involved in, don't necessarily define me. I think my definition is more how I interact with people, I hope in a reasonable form. outside of that, I'm an avid student of philosophy. I was introduced to the Tao Te Ching by my best friend when I was 13 and found it fascinating. Since that day, I fell in love with not only Oriental philosophy, but Western philosophy. And I will not necessarily say I'm definitely not a trained philosopher, but I've studied a great deal, and I love to see how it works within certain concepts and certain portions of Oriental martial arts. Not all maintain a philosophy necessarily. There are those that are premised purely upon physicality, but there are others that are much more in tune with trying to find out what one's nature really is. And that's primarily where I have spent most of my life. I also have been a cook in the past, and so I do enjoy experimenting in the kitchen. Never ask me to repeat a recipe because I won't remember how I created the one I'm working on in the first place. And if you decide you don't like it, then it's easy for me not to recreate it anyhow. And I also really love spending time with my kids and my grandson. My grandson is currently really the only, he's one of two children that I currently teach. Beyond that, I work primarily with black belts, but I do so love teaching another generation.
So I want to dig in just a little bit to something that you said at the beginning of your comment. You said, hey, you use the word curmudgeon, and it sounds like to me, while I don't think that's necessarily true, but it sounds like to me that as you've gotten older, there have been either exogenous or extraneous things that you kind of pushed to the side because perhaps they weren't all that important. And Dave, here's what I want to get at. Is there any room for realization of the essential as we both have come to understand it? Is that also what you're saying?
I would say that at this point in my life, that is my primary interest. What is this essential we're trying to realize? That is a question that has so many different aspects to it. It's a fascinating question.
Could you interrelate that to the Quanmu?
Yes. The essential of the Quanmu is the understanding, and I will quote George Anderson. He stated the Quanmu in 7 very simple yet put together profound words, that we have strong, consistent internal standards, quantifiable, integrated, and related. And the Quanmu Kata, and then the Kwan Chung Kwan are really the things that start to bring us to the real understanding of what is essential. We have many aspects of the Quanmu. We have, of course, the 4 major portions, the Kihon of the basics, the Wasa, partner training, implementation, which is, again, the catalyst between the kata and then the kumite. Now we have the kata, which are the forms, which hold all the principles of what we do, and then the kumite, which is the physical demonstration of what we do within a rule set so that it doesn't get too out of hand. But this idea of trying to find the essential nature, what I think is so misunderstood in Quanmu by students in general, in order to find the answer to the koans or the Zen riddles that are presented within each of the movements, the first effort, second effort, third effort, and then Kwan Kong 1, 2, 3, and 4, the only way to find the answer to the koans as presented is you have to do the form. There is no way to rationalize the answer. And I get a kick out of people who try to intellectualize the koans as stated, when the answer lies purely within doing the form. The problem is you have to be willing to do the form several thousand times. So there's no quick fix, and nor do I think there's a quick fix to finding what is essential in any part of life. It's a path that we have to take, and it's the answer can't always be found.
So this is a really good segue into the next part of the conversation about your specific martial arts history. So give me an idea, or can you share with the listeners your martial arts history in brief? And maybe you can include, how you were introduced to martial arts, what your thinking was, how that's progressed, those kinds of things.
My introduction to the martial arts really started when I first saw the movie Kung Fu with David Carradine. And then later I found it was really interesting when I found out that Bruce Lee had actually written the screenplay for it. Rather fascinating to think about.
I thought that piece of it was interesting, too. Wrote the screenplay, but for whatever reason was not given the role of the primary actor.
Yes. The thing I found most fascinating, and maybe it was a good thing that it was David Carradine instead of Bruce Lee, and I say that tongue-in-cheek. However, David Carradine was an actor and a dancer. He had never done anything in Kung Fu or karate in his life. He didn't even start Kung Fu until after the series was over. But it was the quotes from the Tao Te Ching, the Chuang Tzu, the Analects of Confucius, some of the Buddhist philosophies. Those are the things that really enamored me. It was the way of thinking. It wasn't just the ability to fight, although that was important to me because, when I first came across this, being a man of small stature, I'm 5'5". When I was on the U.S. World Team, I was a robust 132 pounds. I got up to 145 pounds. I was about 115 at the time this came about, and I had been bullied a fair amount, and it had no concept of how to fight or anything of that nature. I really wanted to learn how to protect myself. So, yes, that was a main motivating factor, but it was also the intellectual side that really drew my attention and my desire. I started in 1976. I had asked my parents if I could start earlier. They were totally against it. Karate was very misunderstood in those days. And also, let's bear in mind that this was just shortly after not only World War II, but Korea. And it wasn't an anti-Asian sentiment so much, it was a misunderstanding because the Oriental philosophy, really, the idea of Zen, Buddhism, all these other things didn't really come back in full force to the United States until the 1960s and 70s with Vietnam. And that was when we really started to get an introduction, and it took a great deal longer before the general populace even began to have an understanding of some of this kind of thing. So in 76, I went to Ohio University. Actually, I went to Hawking Technical. I lived in OU. And I came across the Karate Club, and I joined in January of 1976, and I fell in love with it. So I've joked about this for years, but there's some truth to it. I got a degree in business, but I majored in karate. That was my emphasis. I was a fanatic about the stuff. I trained for 2 quarters at Ohio U, and then in the fall of 1976, I transferred to Akron U, entered the Karate Club as quickly as possible, and that's when I met George Anderson. And I trained at Sensei George Anderson in those days. And I trained with Hanshi Anderson until his death in August of 2009. In 1984, I got a place on the U.S. World Team to compete in the 1984 Pan American Games in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. And I did take gold in that. I think one of my fondest memories was Mr. Anderson was Secretary General of the PUCO at the time, and he was the one that awarded my trophy to me, which was really cool. I continued with the world team until 1992. I competed in several international events and got a fair number of accolades, which really carry a great deal of fondness. But my greatest fondness are the times that I was able to travel internationally and nationally with my teacher. Just sitting with that man, as you know from experience, you sit with him for 15 minutes, and I defy you to say you hadn't learned things that you couldn't even conceive that were possible to learn. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So we've kind of sprawled with talking about your introduction into the martial arts, and wow, what a history! Dynamic world travel. We're going to get in specifically to Hanshi Anderson here shortly. But I think the listeners are going to find it really interesting. If you listen to that vitae, that resume that you just talked about, there are going to be people that say, wow, that is so cool. But I have a feeling, with respect to this next question, I think some people are going to be surprised. And the next question is this: give me some of your magical moments, or give me some of your favorite martial arts experiences. And I think some of the listeners are going to say, well, surely it's got to be the world team. But maybe not. What do you think?
You know, it's really difficult to relate a favorite martial arts experience because, to be really honest with you, I've enjoyed all 46 years of my time in Quanmu the relationships the interpersonal relationships I've developed with my brother and sister black belts, the inner fights we had with each other, the disagreements, the agreements, the coming to accord, the having differences that would last for a period of time and then resolving, and in many cases realizing the juvenile responses to certain things. Wow.
So let me ask you this.
Okay.
So for a young athlete, maybe 18, 20 years old, who has aspirations to do what you did, to get on a world team, give me an idea. And maybe shouldn't be couched in favorite moment, because there's not just one. It's a continuum. But what would you say to that young 18, 19, 20-year-old athlete? And then what would you say to someone in maybe our generation, in our 50s and 60s, and maybe somebody a little younger than us, in terms of what your favorites are and how these things change and morph over time? What would you tell that audience?
Well, number one, I would say to the young person, or rather ask the young person, what are you willing to commit in order to attempt to attain this? And in many ways, when you're competing at an international level, you have to kamikaze, because there's no guarantee you're going to win anything. Every young person.
What's that mean? If I'm an 18 or a 19-year-old and maybe I've got 8-9 years of training and I want that gold medal like David Ames got, what's that mean? What do I have to do? Obviously, I've got to have some core competencies, but what else do I have to do?
Well, I led a team of our students for several years in morning workouts. We trained from 6 in the morning, usually until about 9. 45 minutes of that was cardiovascular, keeping the heart rate at 90%, to the point that, I used to jump rope for my first 3-minute rounds, and I could turn the rope 180 times a minute, which still doesn't match Roberto Duran that I watched skip rope and tap his feet out to the William Tell overture. But be that as it may. You have to be willing to commit yourself to extreme training, a point that I've made to many of my students. When my friends went to the concerts, I was in the dojo. When my friends went to the parties, I was in the dojo. When my friends went to the movies, I was in the dojo. I don't regret one bit of it, but I kamikaze. And if you're not willing to do that kind of thing, once, twice, 3 times a week, a few hours a week, you can't reach any kind of athletic level, let alone world class. And Mr. Anderson summed this up very well when he discussed world class. When he first got involved in the AAU, there was a lady who I don't remember her exact position. I think she was the head of the Lake Erie Association for AAU, and she had been an Olympic shot putter, as I understand. And she said, number one, to be an Olympic athlete, you have to be gifted with body. So number one, if you're going to be a world-class athlete, you got to have the body that's going to do it. How do you determine that? There are ways of testing I won't go into tonight. But that's first. You have to have the body that'll do it, not just a dream. Secondly, you have to have a dream. Thirdly, you have to have the courage to implement that dream, and it requires self-sacrifice that I think very few people really understand. And it can really be extremely costly. I've sacrificed a great deal. The cost has been very heavy. I will honestly say if I could go back and do it again, I would change a few of my approaches that would perhaps favor my physical body more than the way I've damaged it. But outside of that, I wouldn't change a thing. The loss, the gain, it's so worth it in the journey because the journey is where it's at.
So it sounds to me, for the young folks listening, or maybe if you're not so young, it sounds to me like one of the golden rules is that there is no success, or generally speaking, there's not a high level of success without a fairly equivalent level of sacrifice. Is it fair to say that?
I would agree with that, but there's another side to that, which is almost a dark side. And that side being that no matter how much you sacrifice, there's no guarantees that there's going to be any kind of income result, as it were.
And that's part of the journey as well. As
exactly,
athletes, we learn quite a bit from failure. It's nice to go out and get trophies and win these competitions and other things. But so much of the learning comes from failure. So there's no guarantees because you know what? It may not be your day. Or you may run into someone who, guess what? They may have sacrificed more than you, and they might be better than you.
There's another side in karate, much more so than any of the sports, because karate has a sporting aspect. But as you know, karate itself is not a sport. It is a way of life. I know a lot of people live their sports as a way of life, but there's really not a philosophy per se to football or to soccer or to wrestling outside of this is athleticism and the goal is to win. Karate is by far deeper than that, and I think even back when it was karate jitsu or more combative than the karate do, which occurred after the Meiji Restoration of 1867, there's still this battling with yourself inside of karate that you don't have in sport. And you have certain people that go purely to the sports side of karate. If that's what they want, that's fine. But I think they're missing the greatest enriching part of the karate experience, which is who am I? What am I?
So, one of the things that I want to talk to everyone who is a part of the Quanmu Monologue is that as we've kind of touched on, but maybe we haven't said it specifically, but maybe now is the time for that, you are not just a martial arts person inside of the dojo. Like that's where we build and mold a lot of things, but most of your life is spent outside of the dojo. So could you speak to that for a minute? We are not just martial artists when we put that gi on. How does that influence our external lives?
That's a great question. I think part of it is process. Part of it is maturing. Part of it is just really trying to understand. Now, what do I mean by that? When I was a young first-degree black belt in 1978, I knew more than anyone could ever know. and I was ready to tell everyone what I knew. As a third, fourth degree black belt, I'd learned a great deal, but I still had this egocentric necessity to say things that other people would hear me say so they would be impressed with my profundity, which was non-existent at the time, I'm sure, and still is not there. And at any rate, as I've gotten older and I've learned more and come to understand more, I have less to say. I don't like to waste my time talking to someone that just wants to have a casual conversation about MMA or something of this nature. If they really want to ask something about karate in general, I'm always happy to engage. But the idea of what martial art is superior or what do you think would happen, and I don't want to waste my time. I really want to engage with people who are serious in learning. One of the points that I make to students many times is go ahead, ask the question. But if you receive an answer you don't like, ask yourself why. You know, if martial arts are supposed to be dealing with a sense of truth, the first truth we have to face is the truth of ourselves, then that requires looking in that doggone mirror of truth, and it's painful, to say the least.
So I think this is an excellent time to talk about Hanshi Anderson. And, my question, he meant so much and so many things to different people, but I'm really interested in Shihan Ames' opinion. What do you think about George Anderson, and how did he influence you?
I think about that man every day of my life. I still have contact with the Anderson family. I had felt like a part of that family, and they welcomed me in. I spent every New Year's Eve at his house from the time we were the karate club, which back when we were the Acronym Karate Club and there were a bunch of young 20-something-year-old testosterone demons, those parties were pretty interesting, to say the least. As we got older, they became much more informed, shall I say. We had really interesting conversations and wonderful interactions with each other. I missed one New Year's Eve party, and that was 2003, and that was right after I had my first hip replaced, and I was not interested in going anywhere at that point. I'd had my hip replaced about 2 weeks before the party. But beyond that, I spent a lot of time with him. I used to go to his house 2-3 times a week, and we would sit together. Mrs. Anderson told me after Hanshi had died that she could remember the two of us sitting in the living room on Tower Hill, looking out of the picture window, which you had seen, that beautiful sight out of his picture window. And we would sit and, as she had said, discuss deep, profound things, I guess. But I learned so much just sitting with him, asking questions. My fondest memory, and perhaps because it was my last memory of him, it was the day before I went into the hospital for my second hip replacement, and it was 3 months, actually 2 months before he died, because I had my hip replaced June 9th, and he died August 9th that summer. But I was having a very deep conversation with him about Kwan, and we spent about 4 hours together, at the least. And I'll never forget, Mr. Anderson would present things to us, so we tried to find the answers or the bunkai within kata, and I can remember as a young brown belt, black belt, asking him, does this technique mean this? And he would say, of course it does. What else would it mean? And he'd just kind of walk away. You were searching for this. Yes, good, you found the answer. But it felt kind of like you've been punked. But that was not the case at all. What he was really doing was not allowing my ego to come to the fore because I found an answer, and he would not allow me to become insufferably pleased with myself, which would have been my ego tendency anyhow. But by this time, our last conversation, I was one of his 8 sons and one of his senior students, and I asked him a question about, does this mean this? And I know in your mind's eye you can see this. He took his hands and brought his index fingers and pointed them towards me and brought them up to about head level. And as he pointed down at me, he laughed and said, "You see it, you see it." It was a point of joy for me because now he was excited and happy to hear one of his seniors understood, and he knew I was not on a path of trying to satisfy my ego. I was trying to figure out what the heck it really meant. I'll never forget that till the day I die. It was a wonderful experience, and he was a very kind, very caring, very nurturing person. If you were allowed to become a part of his inner circle. If you weren't, you might see him as a cold, callous, harsh, tough karateka. There were so many sides to this man. He was he was just a miasma of so many sides. To try and sum him up in one way would be just foolish to try. But the man was like a father to me. And when he passed, it was crushing. But I remember at the funeral, I was actually asked by people because I have a tendency towards stoicism because of my father, and I don't regret that at all. I'm not prone to displaying a lot of emotions, which as a kid, I was very emotional. But I didn't really display anything because I remember his words to me at one point about self-control. And I said to one of my best friends at his funeral, I can just imagine that if I display extreme emotion at this time, he's going to come back and slap the snot out of me and say, "Stop it, I taught you better than that." And I'm glad he did, because I grieved, very much so, but in my own time and in my own private way. I didn't need to display it with anyone else. It wasn't anyone else's business. It was no one else's affair. And that's pretty much how I encapsulate my emotions in this day and age. I have to deal with them. No one else needs to.
So one of the things that I always appreciated, and there's so many things, and you are correct, George Anderson was a multifaceted, multifactorial character, an icon within martial arts. One of the things I was always fascinated by Mr. Anderson is that if you showed up and you said, you know, I do whatever it is, I do Wadaru or Shotokan or whatever system that you said, if you were, let's just say, a casual practitioner of that system, chances are George Anderson knew more about your system than you did. And I had seen this many, many times over. And so I always certainly appreciated the intellect that he brought to the martial arts, someone who could talk to you about how Kodokan Judo has essential elements that you would find in something like some Okinawan system or some Shotokan system. Is just unbelievably unusual in his ability to synthesize material that was highly complex. That was just my take on it. But I want to get into the meat of this question.
Can I interject in that for just a brief moment?
Of course.
I agree with everything you said, and I think that those who come from my generation with George Anderson will agree. To see how the Kwamakan has developed, intensified, and deepened over the years, going back into the 1970s when I started with him, as already a very insightful individual. but looking at how things developed over time, looking at how he studied. That was the thing. He studied. And the brilliance with which he assembled the Kwan Kong Chung Kwan is just absolutely amazing. And it is, to me, an ultimate thesis of his entire life work. It is so deep as far as I am concerned. It encapsulates literally the system. But if you don't understand the levels you have to progress through and you just watch the form, you'll never understand what he was really trying to impart. It's so much deeper than just watching a kata.
And you've got to be willing to accept the idea and the notion that there is a journey. And the reason that there is a journey is so that you can pick up these pieces of things, these fundamentals, these building blocks. So as you progress in this journey, it's a synthesis. It makes sense. It's not a mere collection of stuff.
I agree. Yes. Yeah. So I think you've hit the nail right on the head. Yes.
Can I ask you? This is a question that may be a concern to all of us who have at this point decades of experience in the martial arts. But where do you think martial arts are today?
I'm a little concerned as far as the traditional Oriental martial arts. I believe that this day and age, the traditions of Karate-Do and Karate-Jitsu are losing substantial ground to methods such as MMA and BJJ now, and sport karate in general. Now, I don't denigrate those, but I see MMA and BJJ as being very specific methodologies. They're not necessarily geared towards a development of a search for perfection of character. I suppose that depends on how the individual teacher teaches it. But to me, it's starting to lack a process. There has been a great attraction all the way back to when you and I were competing. It's the glitz, the glitter, and the imagined accolades of becoming a champion. There's so much of that wanting to be famous. And we forget that the old Okinawan karate, if you were caught training, it could lead to your instant death. There were no belts. It wasn't a matter of belts. It's a matter of, and there was no sense of standardization. You were taught by your teacher what you needed to know. It was very individualized. It was very structured in that sense, but this is where the Japanese didn't have an appreciation for it. Konishi Yasuhiro had repeatedly said he did not believe that Okinawan karate was a complete martial art because it was not standardized, and he was very Japanese, and he was a judoka, which, of course, had been established by Jigoro Kano, a Ph.D. in education. Let's go ahead and figure where the standardization in that one's going to come out. So, and the Japanese in general are very standardized. The Okinawans are a totally different culture. They're much more, shall I say, relaxed in that sense. So,
but too, David, a general reluctance towards the sport aspect. This was much too of a serious, deadly business to be watered down by sport. And so I guess to the extent that is the truth, that is the case, when I ask the question, where's the martial arts at today, have we suffered because of sport and the accolades that come with it?
We have to a degree, but we don't necessarily have to. Let me elucidate on that point. True Karate-Do encompasses self-defense, body balancing, and insight into one's true nature as addressed in The Search for Perfection of Character, shall we say, which was one of Funakoshi's major things. Karate Jitsu, on the other hand, addresses combat specifically. My own observations of the WKF, which is very much sport karate since that's the Olympic governing body, are that the kata has, in my opinion, been oversimplified and emphasizes the athleticism. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it seems that over generations, taking Kushanku from the Okinawan, moving it into the Japanese and getting into the Kanku Dai, et cetera, it seems that it's being simplified. And, of course, one of the things that it was suggested to me years ago is, yes, the Japanese did simplify the katas. In the first place, this was pointed out to me by a student of mine who's a professor of philosophy at Akron U, and specifically Oriental philosophy, and he actually went to Japan and trained for 2 years in the Aido and Aikido, lived there, taught English, and studied with them. And as he said, in Japan, the students, when you get into college in Japan, I don't know about today, but back in the 80s, this seemed to be the case, the majority of your really hard work had completed in high school, which is very intense in Japan. It's not that you're just going to float through in college or anything of that nature, no. But in the United States, you get into college, and that's when your work begins, and you find out you really don't know what you're talking about from what they taught you in high school. So therefore, the people who come into karate train really, really intensely, hours a day. So in a very short period of time, like the 4 years of attaining your bachelor's, you can achieve a very high level of technical skill. However, in most cases, the student then, after they graduate and they get a job in the corporate world, they're never going to train again, because there's no time. You are now married to the company. So you do have the senseis, but these are very rare individuals who address themselves to that, and they're not the most respected in Japan, because Japan respects, for the most part, those who work for companies that produce the greatest amount in the GMP. And karate doesn't do that. So this idea that in Japan, if you're a sensei, you're so highly regarded and respected, that's actually a fallacy. It's a wives' tale. So you don't do that for accolades. You do it for the purpose of doing it. And this is one part of the Japanese connection. Now, in Okinawa, you train for life. So it's not a matter of the quick accolades, et cetera. So it is much more complex in that regard, much more sophisticated. So that's the difference between the Okinawan katas, the Japanese katas, the understanding of the Okinawan sense of chinkuchi, which transcends the Japanese sense of kime in that regard. I think that's very, very important to understand. When you get into the sport, I don't mind it, but I was very disturbed with the Olympics. The reason I was is I can't stand watching the sport that I love, because let's face it, I was on the world team. I did karate as a sport, okay? Let's accept that. It was sport karate. That's not your traditional karate, which I also engage in. However, in my time, if you showed extreme celebration on the receiving of your award, your medal, you could be disqualified. And it was immediately handed to the next person. Now, a very humorous example of that is when I won the Pan American game, I was so used to just having my medal put around my neck, bowing, walking out of the floor, and I would just unceremoniously take the medal off and just drop it into my gi bag and go on to the next event. I couldn't stand watching these little kids walking around with all their medals jingling and jangling, because you're emphasizing the wrong point for your kid. But be that as it may, I won the Pan Am gold, and Mr. Anderson took his hands as though he was going to hold them up over his head, telling me to take this trophy and hold it up over my head to show I'd won. And that was entirely alien to me. And the funniest thing, there were 6 newspapers in San Pedro Sula. The only copy of the newspaper I saw was the one that the guy took a picture when the trophy was right in front of my face. And I thought, well, that's rather poetic when I think about it. I thought that was humorous because I don't like the accolades, and I can't stand watching these people win and playing WWE when they're winning and growling on the sidelines like we see in the NBA. I feel that the athletes of today really need to develop a sense of composure and self-control. And that's what karate is supposed to emphasize. But now it's being allowed to slide. And that is a concern I have, because how are we going to develop a search for perfection of character, or even the sense of trying to become a reasonable member of society, when we're emphasizing the champion concept of winning and I'm all that? So that's a concern I have.
So I think those of us who have trained for a long time, over decades, I think we generally are, we're displeased by the display of flamboyance, because it's just not how we came up. We don't like it, and this is just not karate. We see this across other disciplines, American football, the NBA. And particularly for me, I have seen a number of football players do this. And by the way, you could be losing by 3 touchdowns, and you wouldn't know it by the display of these individual accolades. So I'm with you, and it's certainly unfortunate and distasteful from my view.
I think that if they want to allow that to become a part of the sports scene, be that as it may, but for God's sake, I hope the traditional teachers are actually guiding, if they're really senseis and not just teachers, truly people who are pointing the way by the example of themselves. Or better yet, let's use the term hanshi. Hanshi, which essentially is one who sets the example. If one is truly a hanshi, is it just a title that one carries because it's a high-ranking accolade, or do they actually live it? And if they actually live it, the students will pick up on that within traditional training. Unfortunately, we have so many, quote, karate schools, taekwondo schools, whatever, that all they do is line their windows with trophies to show how great they are. And it brings a story to my attention. Years ago, I had come across this story of this gentleman who had trained in Japan, in Shiryu, for several years, like almost 10 years. And then he came to the United States, and he opened a dojo. And at one point, he brought his teacher over to teach. And his teacher noticed all these trophies in the window, in the front, etc. And his teacher said something to him that he said profoundly affected his life. He said, perhaps you need to look at keeping the trophies in the back room and the courtesy in the front room, because he found that his students had become arrogant through their victories. And they had lost the sense of, Funakoshi said, when the fool gets his first-degree black belt, he can't wait to boast of his prowess. The wise man bows and trains harder. When the fool gets a second-degree black belt, he can't wait to go to the parties and brag and demonstrate. The wise man, I think we should say wise person, because there are incredible female martial artists in this day and age, and we need to embrace that fully. The wise person bows deeper and trains harder. When the fool gets his third-degree black belt, he can't wait to get into his automobile, driving around the streets, honking his horn, proclaiming his prowess to the world. The wise man bows deeper and walks along the wall that none may see them. I finally hit a point in my life. I like the wall. It's a nice place to be.
Well, Shihan David Ames, one who continues to set the example, and one who continues to be the guiding light for others who want to be on that wall with you. I can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you for being a part of the Quanmu Monologue. And I can't wait for the listeners to be able to hear this. Is there anything else? Parting thoughts?
No, I think we've covered a lot. You ask me, are there parting thoughts? You know that's a dangerous question, Ron. But there's so much to be said about this world that one can give too much. I hope we've given enough tonight to allow people to digest something and to really think and consider it. It's not a matter of whether one agrees or whether one disagrees. One of the points I make to my students whenever I lecture, which I lecture a fair amount, as I'm sure that is evident, but as I tell them, my lectures are not for you to agree with or disagree with. They are to stimulate thought. And so therefore, in the Zen form, just allow the words to pass through you. Don't judge them. Just let them pass through. And you may find things that your judgment precludes you from being able to find. And I'll end with that.
And on that note, a truly stimulating conversation. Shihan David Ames, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this time.
Absolutely.
Quanmu.
Quanmu.